Good evening, everyone. I am here with my wife and their Berthold and their Spurlock. We live in another home park just right down the street.
Could you give your address, Robert, please?
Sure, it says, I signed my name on the list there. So, anyway, the address is 7021 Northeast 181st, Stage 3. And we've been there 31 years, going on 32 years. And we like to live in the city. Kendall, we thought become a city. In fact, I was one of the voters who voted in favor of incorporation because I thought it was a forward-moving movement, which would be better for all. Now, we find us in a predicament where they want to outzone our home park and limit the home, and that's all nice and everything. It's always good to upgrade the community, but at the same time, don't forget the people who are so being affected by this outzoning, and we heard that we were going to talk some about mobile homes tonight. That's why we showed up today. And we are kind of looking at some sort of a timeline when these things are supposed to take place, whether it be a year or 2 years or whatever. And I don't know if the commission has established any sort of a timeline for that or not. So I appreciate all your hard work on this project, and I know you want to be fair to all of us who are so being affected by this outzoning, and thank you very much for being here. Thanks.
Thank you, Robert. I can tell you that we have sent our recommendation on mobile home parks to the City Council, and I think Lori is here and can further clarify, but I believe it is still before the City Council. What they will actually, that it's happening, and it's now before the City Council. And again, Lori, our city planner, can, I think, fill us in maybe a little more on exactly where the City Council is in that process. So thank you. So our next item is approval of the minutes, the August 7th Planning Commission minutes. Any discussion, changes? Do I hear a motion?
Move to approve the minutes.
Moved and seconded to approve the August 7th Planning Commission meeting minutes. Any further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, nay. Minutes are approved unanimously. Our next item is the 2018 Comprehensive Plan Amendments Memo. So we'll welcome our City Staffer, Lori Anderson. Yeah, this would be a good time, Lori. While you were out, I told Robert that we had submitted our recommendation to the City Council, and the mobile home communities matter is now before the council. Do you have any updates on?
Right.
We've seen a sort of I guess a preliminary recommendation or policy direction from the council, but can you maybe fill us and Robert in on where things stand with that?
Right. I think we can combine two activities. I'm happy
Okay.
to tell you what the council has decided so far, and that folds right into the comprehensive plan amendments that we're going to be talking about this evening. So on the 17th of September, the City Council looked at a number of options. They had added a few options since they received your recommendation, and they ultimately supported your recommendation for the 2 parks on Northeast 175th Street, asking for long-term preservation. For the other 4 parks, including Mr. Spurlock's park, they asked that there be a 10-year permanent protection. And then after the 10 years, then an upzone would occur with affordability requirements. It's a phased kind of a zoning. That was an option I think you all looked at early on, so it may be familiar to you. So with that direction, we have gone ahead and edited the comprehensive plan. There were several elements affected, the land use element, the housing element, and then the downtown sub-element. And the idea is that we're providing in those amendments, which you have in your packet, some additional detail on the parks, and then establishing a new zoning district that we're calling MHC. It actually is not a zoning district at this point. It's still in the comprehensive plan, but that would be the parallel to the zoning district. And that would be applied to the two parks on Northeast 175th Street for the long-term preservation. We are not recommending changing the comprehensive plan for the other parks at this point, although I'm sure you'll hear testimony about that at your public hearing, which we hope to have at your next meeting, November 6th. But for the comprehensive plan, which is the long-term vision, we are suggesting that that designation only be placed over the two parks for long-term preservation. So with that, I think we can just proceed if you have questions about those amendments, and otherwise I can talk about the natural environment element.
Yes, question. For the four mobile home parks for which we would not make a comprehensive plan amendment, how would the phased approach be implemented? Would that be an ordinance or?
Right. So after the comprehensive plan is adopted, and we're bringing that forward first because, as you know, we can only adopt comprehensive plan changes once a year. Capital facilities element and shoreline are two exceptions to that rule, and strangely, you'll be seeing amendments. You just saw the capital facilities a few months ago, and you'll be seeing the shoreline later this year again in a separate action. But because we can only do those amendments once a year, we are moving ahead first with the comprehensive plan amendments, and then the council will be considering zoning amendments, which would enact their direction at the beginning of 2019.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So just to clarify, there's no further role for the commission in this?
Not with the
issue.
Zoning issue. With the comprehensive plan, it's a requirement that the Planning Commission consider comprehensive plan amendments.
Okay, go. So would you like us to ask questions on all the elements that are proposed, or what's the most?
So I think probably
way
it might be easier to talk first about the changes recommended for those elements that are addressing the mobile home parks. So if you had questions or comments about that, we could tackle those now. That was three. Again, that was the land use element, the housing element, and the downtown sub element. There were amendments there, and then the amendment to the comprehensive plan map.
So I'm, on page 4A15, is this a new designation that you're talking about? That's highlighted?
Correct. Yeah, and if you look to the end of these amendments, the map, the end of this, see if I can find exactly which page it is. It's possible that it's the very last page in your packet, is the change to the comprehensive plan map that would put that designation. It is the last page in the packet. It would put that designation over the two parks on Northeast 175th Street.
Well, that doesn't apply to all of them?
If staff felt that if you put that designation over all of the parks, that led you to an assumption that over the 20-year horizon of the plan, the intent was long-term preservation. That's not exactly the council's direction. The council says for 10 years, there should be preservation. But then at that point, it basically would revert to the other zoning and with an upzone with affordability. So that's why we had, this point, had only applied it to those two.
So are the specifics related to the upzoning after 10 years, is that part of the comprehensive plan? Where did
No,
that language come from?
that will be part of the zoning that would
That'll
follow.
be taken up later
Correct.
with the council.
Correct. Right.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one thing on this statement here on, it says, the manufactured housing community district promotes residential development that is higher density, but single family in character. But it's higher density only against single house.
Correct.
Yeah.
It's a multifamily density.
Yeah, I mean, because if you put an apartment up, it'd be more density.
Right, correct.
Okay, so we shouldn't say that higher density than single family?
Yeah, that's fine. That would be,
Yeah, because you know,
yeah. If the rest of the commissioners agree, I'm happy to make that change.
That's fine with that?
So what I'm hearing you make mention of, Mr. McDonald, Commissioner McDonald, is that the statement that reads, the manufactured housing community district promotes residential development that is higher density, but single family in character. And are you making the statement that you would like some clarification about that?
well, I don't think it's really a true statement because it's not only via single housing is it higher density. I don't think it's more density than the apartments over here across the street.
So
Right.
maybe the staff could clarify what you meant by
Well,
that statement.
I think what Commissioner McDonald was saying is that the sentence could be amended to read, the manufactured housing community district promotes residential development that is higher density than single family, but single family in character.
Then maybe that's what you should say, because it doesn't say that.
That's what we,
That's the amendment
that's the
that we're
proposed
recommending.
amendment.
Okay, so we're recommending that change be made?
Yes.
That's what-
Commissioner McDonald did,
Yeah.
and
Okay.
if everyone agrees, then we'll make that change.
Can you go over the revised wording? Just
All
to be
right.
we're all sure in
I-
what we're
Do you want me to read it again?
I'd like you to, because you did it beautifully.
Thank
You do
you.
that for a living.
So that last sentence would be amended to read, the manufactured housing community district provides residential development that is higher density than single family, but single family in character.
Okay, so you changed the word promote to provide. Did you mean to do that?
Promotes. If I said provides, I'm sorry. It
Okay,
should be
just
promotes.
checking. I heard,
Yeah,
I
no,
heard
it
you
should be
say
promotes.
provide, so
Yeah, no.
promote is better. Okay,
The only addition was than single family after higher density.
okay. Okay, just for my clarification, I need to understand what you mean by single family in character.
Single family usually refers to detached housing units that a single family, single household lives in. It's not attached like an apartment or a condominium or a townhouse. So it's a detached dwelling unit separate from other dwelling units.
So in other words, it's not a 5-story building where all the units share walls.
Correct. Or, right, or townhouses or condos.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate you clarifying that.
I had a couple of, anybody else got anything you want to? I had a couple of wording, sort of questions, possible changes. Excuse my voice here. Let's see if I can take me a little while to. Okay. Yeah, on, well, it's page 43, and I guess the full document, it's under the downtown, it's the downtown strategy, and then there's 4 components, and then it talks about land use, the now, or what will be presumably 4 districts. It's on
Right, 4B8.
4B8, and then
And
actually,
4B9.
my point was on I guess the following,
Mhm.
the following page. It talks about the existing manufactured housing communities, as we discussed, are housing. And then it talks about may be appropriate for long-term preservation, others may not be compatible with the future downtown vision. I'm just wondering if somewhere in that description we can or should include some information about what either the council's direction or final decision is, because as it's written, it's kind of vague. It says some things may be appropriate, but it seems like the council has a fairly specific plan for the four downtown communities. So I'm wondering if we could include something that references I know it's not final yet, but references at least the strategic direction there.
Yeah, I would, as staff, I would not recommend that, just because it's still in flux, and once the final decision for the 6 parks is put in here, that would limit all flexibility for the council that has not made their final decision yet. So I was deliberately trying to be kind of vague about some may be appropriate for long-term preservation, others may not, assuming that that's kind of where the council is headed. Some will be and some won't, but I didn't want to necessarily tie their hands.
Oh, I see. Okay,
specifically.
in this specific document. Okay.
So, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Carol.
So basically, where the council is right now, they have not made a final decision about their 10-year preservation plan. They're still discussing that, or has that actually been decided?
Well, they've sent us that direction, but they haven't seen the code amendments yet. So there will be another public hearing, and so the council, of course, just as you all can change your mind between the time of a public hearing and a final decision, still could make a different recommendation if they chose to do so. So I had been hesitant to say specifically about the parks in here, and am recommending that it just be a little broader so it doesn't tie the council's hands. The map, on the other hand, where the 2 parks on 175th are identified for long-term preservation, if the council were to change their mind on any of the parks, they could come back to the comprehensive plan without endangering the park during its 10-year preservation period and change the map. Do you see what I'm saying?
So they could rezone it.
They could change the comp plan map next year if they change their mind. But if we have specific text in here, I think it just makes it a little more complicated in terms of what they can do with the zoning.
Okay, I guess I'm fine with that wiggle room. I see why it was. Excuse me. It was written as such. Anybody else have any thoughts on that particular one? Then the other thing I had is on page 59 of the full. Excuse me, 59 of the full document. It's housing element 5.6, and it's again, it's page 59 in the whole. It's under what section? It's under.
It's on page housing element 5-6. You mentioned that.
Yeah, is that?
Okay.
There's a map called Figure H7, and it talks
Correct.
about towards the end there, and I certainly agree with everything that was included here. It talks about the concerns about the long-term park maintenance and replacement of the infrastructure, and concern about manufactured housing is offered, relatively affordable housing when parks are closed. Homeowners lose most of their investment, and I think there's a lot of truth there. I was thinking that it might also be appropriate to add a little bit about redevelopment offering opportunities to expand the number of multifamily housing units in the city, including affordable housing. Because I think as written, it doesn't paint, I don't think, the complete picture about the housing communities, manufactured housing communities, and what may become of them. So I guess I'm looking for maybe a little more balanced description of, in addition to the concerns, which are certainly very valid, but also include a little bit about the opportunities, as we discussed, at length, about what could happen with redevelopment, again, with provisions for providing opportunities for some current residents. So that was my thought there, and my
So maybe something like future redevelopment could provide opportunities for additional housing units and increased with.
Are we going to do that one that I?
Now we'll do
spoke
natural
about?
environment. Okay, so I heard 2 changes, and I will make those changes, and then we'll bring it back for you to take a look at. Now I'm going to change notebooks. Okay, so this next set of amendments has to do, obviously, with the natural environment element, and this is a precursor to all of the critical area changes that you would be looking at over the next several weeks. So I'm not sure there is anything astonishing in here. We would have the new maps, which are still in draft but should be finalized very soon, those generalized maps that go in the comprehensive plan. Under the geologically hazardous areas, there was some language added about tsunamis and seishes. And otherwise, I guess the most text is in the section on habitats. As you know, you all had a very robust discussion about the habitats. So, unless you have specific questions.
So the recommendations that we, stated are incorporated in all this?
Well, this is just the comprehensive plan. So this is the broad policy language that supports the changes to the regulations that you have really reviewed. So hopefully they would be in sync with what you've told us so far. And when you get to the regulations, then you'll be going into the very specifics of the gap analysis and all those changes that you requested we make. So this is like the background, updating the background policy to support those regulations.
I think we have to defer to you, I would think, because
Well, we tried to do it.
it's very specific on all this stuff, and until you're talking about it and you get in the weeds in it, then you can, oh yeah, I remember that. But
Right.
otherwise, it's hard to remember all that stuff.
Okay.
Mr. Mendeline.
On the first page under the purpose section, minor point, you deleted the Growth Management Act, which I think is great in the title, and added state requirements. But as you can see, the second paragraph under that, we actually refer to federal requirements as well. Should we maybe make that title be federal and state requirements?
That would be fine. Yeah, I think we were thinking it was administered by Ecology, but they are federal requirements.
I could see how you'd say that, but
Yeah.
I could also
Okay,
see
so
there are
why
other
don't we
federal
change that
requirements that may come into this that
to
we don't cite here. Just
federal
federal
and
form.
state? We will do it.
That's an
I'm
easy
assuming
change.
pardon me?
Everybody's,
That's an easy change.
Trying to make it easy.
everyone's all right with that, I think? Yeah, okay.
I had a couple of, clarifications. One is on page, 82 in the full document, 4D11, under the natural environment sub-element at the
4D11,
At
okay.
At the bottom of that page, which has basically half a page of text and half blank, talks about Kenmore's critical area regulations. And it talks about the year-round buffer around an active rookery, and it takes out I guess the 900-foot radius that was previously in there. Is there I mean, I guess this is maybe getting a little in the weeds, but is there a distinction between a year-round buffer and 900 feet? Is there a reason the actual,
the only
distance was
reason,
taken out?
yeah, the only reason we changed that, the 900 feet was removed because, as you recall, the regulations now are recommending, I think it's 656, I don't know why it's so specific, but 656 feet. So we're, again, realizing that these buffers are changing, so we kind of backed off again, because this is a policy document. We backed off the specific, but it is a year-round
Right, okay.
Yeah.
So that'll be reflected
in the regulations. The
regulations,
656 feet, definitely.
approximately, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see, on page, on page 4D17, which is a few, I guess, 6 pages down there. So I see that we added on bullet D at the very last point there, to designate and protect the following fish and wildlife habitats of importance, habitat for bald eagles. Can you
Right.
maybe refresh my memory on, was that part of our discussions, or was there another? You actually
So,
included that.
Right. That was included because,
Page 4D17, Carol.
although the state doesn't, you'll recall that the state doesn't regulate bald eagle habitat anymore.
Right.
They're off the listed
Right.
list. But that there was, it was bald and golden eagle. Amy can. Yeah, there are federal rules, and where you all ended up in the regulations was that what you wanted was that a person, if they had a bald eagle nest on their property, they were going to submit a certificate to us confirming that they complied with the federal rules. So that's why it's here, because
Okay.
there still is some element of concern, even though the city's not regulating it,
Gotcha, okay.
other than to make sure that they comply with the federal standards.
Okay, it's coming back to me.
Okay.
Then on, oh, well, I guess, are we gonna, is this, the geologic hazard features, are there in part of this, oh geez, page, 7 more pages in the full document. There's the map about the, on 4D21, I guess or maybe this is a whole nother section. There's a geologic hazard features, there's a map there.
Correct. Right.
And these are draft maps, okay.
Correct.
So, well, my question was basically about, and maybe it's a little too much in the weeds for this discussion, but the floodplains, how often are those reviewed in terms of, are there new delineations of what's in a floodplain and what's not?
Right. So the floodplain maps, the first place we look to for the mapping is they're maps produced by FEMA, and the map that we have is super old.
Like
so,
how old, like?
I don't know. It's like the 1990s, maybe. And you, Amy, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's that old. But they are in the process of updating that map, at least for the Sammamish River. And so there's a draft map in the regulations that we'll be referencing that's 2013. And the floodplains that are on the hydrologic features map,
Yeah.
those are based on the 2013 mapping. We decided that we're pretty sure they're going to approve those maps, and we think it's more accurate information. So that updated floodplain information is incorporated in this hydrologic features map.
Good, okay. So are they generally going to be updated more frequently then? I mean, it seems like floodplains,
Yeah,
climate change, they may be a need for more frequent update. I'm mostly
Yeah.
wondering how these will evolve over, the 10 and 20 and 30.
Yeah, I'm not sure how often FEMA looks at their maps. We've been very interested in having them look at our Swamp Creek area particularly but they haven't told us that they're starting on that. So there are other resources that we use. For example, and I can't think of them off the top of my head, but there's a list in the draft regulations that you guys will see at your next meeting, where, for example, if there were hydrologic studies that were done up on 73rd when the bridge up there was replaced, there's a whole wealth of resources beyond these. They're called FIRM, F-I-R-M maps that can provide data and hopefully update data. Even new development that goes in there, if they have to do a study, then that information is more resource for us to figure out where the floodplain is.
Just a question, as these maps are updated, is there any requirement or functionally, as you're reviewing zoning or development, that you would be required to either go to the most current map or you refer to the map that's in the current comprehensive plan? How does the regulation and development review
Right.
relate to
So,
current mapping?
so we never look to the comprehensive plan map for the maps. We have a different set of, much like the zoning map, we have a different set of critical area maps. But those maps specifically state that the mapping on those maps is not the defining feature. The existence of the feature is what defines it for purposes of zoning. So, for example, we've had cases where someone was mapped in a floodplain, but the truth of the matter was they were not in the floodplain. So that study that proved that they weren't in the floodplain exempts them from the regulations. On the other hand, if the firm map didn't show someone was in a floodplain, but we had information that showed that in fact that was now the floodplain, then that would be the controlling factor.
That's what I was trying to confirm, is that the mapping that's in the comprehensive plan doesn't drive regulation.
Correct. It's actually the
You can
presence
take
of
into
the
account
feature.
More current studies. Thank you.
Okay, good. So there is provisions for.
Yeah, that's what I want to make sure,
okay.
because you can't update them more than once a year. You could get really stuck into,
Well, yeah, yeah.
Right.
so it's the other way around.
Right. And the
Need
same
more
with
current studies to
the same with streams, wetlands, geologic hazards. All of the maps are a guidepost to say we think this feature is here, and so then we pursue, and if studies are needed, then we follow that.
Good, thanks. Well, I'm glad to hear it's updated on a hopefully a more frequent basis.
Yeah,
in the
I wouldn't
future.
hold my breath for the firm maps.
Well, okay.
At least we have one more recent one.
Just for our clarification, since we are updating this based on what we do have available, is there any attempt on the city staff's part to contact FEMA or the federal agencies to get a more current, say, geological hazard features map?
Yeah, so FEMA doesn't have that, but King County does, and we absolutely, all the new LIDAR mapping, it's called
Sure.
LIDAR
Yeah,
mapping.
I remember they were talking
We have
about
all
that.
of their new LIDAR mapping that we're using for geologic, and in fact, we're still waiting for some information there.
Okay.
As far as wetlands and streams, we had an intern this past year who had an exhaustive project of going back to
Yeah.
2003 and going through every file that had a critical area in it, finding the maps of the feature, figuring out what characteristics of the feature were important, logging it all into a database, which then was used to create the new wetland and stream maps. So we have tried to be totally comprehensive in terms of what information we have, so that we have the most recent information.
So you've compiled the data, but did they actually send anyone physically into the field to look at that?
So that data came from reports that were done by people in the field.
Okay.
So it was, for example, a private development, and they
Okay.
hired someone
Sure.
to go delineate the wetland. So that information was then given to us,
Okay.
and that's the information that was added to the map.
I have a nephew who's a hydrologist for
Oh.
Snohomish County,
Uh-huh.
so I've been picking his brain a little bit.
Yeah, that was a good question.
Any more questions or thoughts on the comprehensive plan amendments from my colleagues here? Anything more we should? do
Not
tonight, Lori, on these? Or?
Not with the comprehensive plan amendments. So the next step is to hold a public hearing. And so that's scheduled for November 6th. Again, we're trying to meet this end of the year deadline. So you'll hold your public hearing and hopefully that evening make your final recommendations.
Mitigation sequencing is,
Yeah.
I understand the
So-
words, but just not sure exactly how that,
It's
what that means in practice.
it's basically a sequence of steps that you have to follow when you're designing any kind of a project that might impact critical areas or buffers, and it just starts with avoid. So thinking for any type of project, how you could avoid the critical area and its buffer, and then sort of moving down the list. Then if you can't avoid the buffer or the critical area, how can you minimize the impacts on it? And then if you can't minimize, or you've done all you can minimizing, but there's still remaining impacts left, then how you would mitigate or compensate for those impacts. So that's just sort of the sequence. And I think one of the issues that came up several times in our discussion with the agencies was that they weren't understanding that this PAUE that we're proposing does not eliminate the requirement for applicants to go through a mitigation sequencing process and do what they can to first avoid, minimize, and mitigate. But for a variety of reasons, the folks that are pursuing a PAUE are in situations where they can only mitigate or avoid and minimize so far, and then the rest is going to have to be mitigation and departing from some of the standard processes that are allowed in the critical areas regulation. So we talked about needing to do that. We're going to make sure that applicants have kind of done a first round of mitigation sequencing and developing their master plans, like for a parks department or a school district, that they've done some mitigation sequencing just in picking sites or thinking about where a school's going to go or a park process. And then that would be the first level. And then when they get to actually developing a school or a park project on that selected site, again, going through kind of mitigation sequencing for that site, and then demonstrating very clearly to the state how you went through that process and what the substantive outcomes were.
Yeah, I was just going to remind everyone about why the PAUE was important and why we're interested in putting that regulation back in. So we had that regulation for many years, and we used it for different things. For example, when SR 522 had to be expanded, we had a critical area issue that we could not avoid. There was no way to avoid it. It's a state highway. The lanes had to go where the lanes had to go. The facility was pre-existing. Similarly, a school district might need some relief. They have a already purchased piece of property. Maybe their field is close to a stream or a wetland, Kenmore Junior High, for example. They can't pick up and move. They may not be able to avoid the impact. And what happened was that there was a concern that really that rule was written only for utilities, linear utilities. And that's kind of the decision, the interpretation that got us into trouble, because all of a sudden that area of the code was only to be used for utilities, like a communication line or an electrical line or who knows what, but a sewer main. And so all of a sudden there was no opportunity to talk about other kinds of facilities that provide significant public benefits, but they didn't have a way to get out of these rules that you really couldn't accommodate very easily. So that's the push for going back to having a public agency and utility exception. That's why we're looking at it. That's why we're talking with the agencies about it and trying to come to some agreement on when it would be acceptable.
So following up on that, there was note that you had a proposal, but it was turned down to expand it from, if I read this right, on page 7 of that section. So would this new proposal then have to pass muster with, the growth management Hearings Board?
No, the new proposal, the concern with the proposal that was done a few years ago was that the Growth Management Hearings Board felt that we had not adequately assessed best available science. And if this rule was to be implemented, could it be justified through best available science? So what we are trying to do, and why we're meeting with the agencies, why there was a forum, is to say, how can we make best available science part of this regulation so that everyone is comfortable with it? It doesn't have to go back to the Growth Management Hearings Board. That would only happen if someone appealed it. But it does need to pass muster with the agencies. And incidentally, this exception, the PAUE, is not an exception that is allowable or permissible in the shoreline jurisdiction. So it doesn't even apply in the shoreline jurisdiction, although the whole discussion about when is it appropriate for a public agency to do something in a critical area or by a critical area could be helpful in the shoreline to give us some guidance on when is, what type of mitigation is preferred, what standards should you be looking at, and that kind of thing.
So does it have to pass, you say pass muster with all the agencies that could potentially be affected?
No,
Schools, fire districts, you say pass
yeah,
muster,
no, they don't have to. They don't have to look at it.
Approve
The Growth
it,
Management Hearings Board. It doesn't have to go to the Growth Management Hearings Board. Ecology will certainly be looking at it, and Commerce, right?
Well, thanks for that context. Anybody have any?
Just maybe more comment, something you can respond to, think about. But as I was thinking about this, you gave a good example of the junior high school. You could put a plan in place or a proposal in place for a junior high school, and then also have growth projections that say that you're going to need something much larger than what you're building 10 or 15 years down the line. So I'm worried about the almost inevitability of getting into a situation where you're going to come up against the fact that you have a constraint here, that as you grow, you're going to grow into and against that constraint. How do you deal with that, particularly in some place like Kenmore, which is likely to see some of that pressure given our limited land availability? Just looking at those maps and seeing where the constraints are. If you don't take that into account somehow in the original review and plan for the junior high school or the road or something else, are we setting ourselves up for the inevitability of that sort of problem? So how do you or can you require or have that sort of review as part of the initial review and approval of the project?
Well, it would always be part of the initial review and approval. The problem is that many of these facilities already exist, so we're well past approval stage. And in those cases, that is why this particular regulation is so critical, because the message is we can't avoid it. The facility has to get bigger. It is a very important public facility. So how can we mitigate it, consider options, address it in a way that allows both good things to happen? You somehow have enhanced the critical area, but also allowed the school to get bigger.
So given the situation we're in, the real emphasis then, the time needs to be spent on thinking through what the potential mitigation steps are.
Right.
Given just the level of development we're at today.
And how to show the agencies that you've thoughtfully gone through those other avoid and minimize steps to the extent practicable. I've worked on a number of school projects, and a lot of them, they've got that are remodels and that sort of thing. And my kids go to schools that just got remodeled, and they don't necessarily get bigger, but they need to use all the square footage they've already got and can't suddenly give any up to recover buffers. And so they're doing a lot of going up. I think my kids are in a 2-story building, and last year they were in a 1-story building. So I think those kinds of things are happening, but it's more that the pressure to restore the buffer and, now you're rebuilding the school, so now you need to come into conformance, and that means revegetate all these 150-foot buffers. Well, then you'd end up with like this little, 20-story school building that's like this big. So that's kind of, I think, where we're seeing it. But you're right, this is not really intended for solutions for new schools, and then figuring out how to kind of use the PAUE later if you know you need to get bigger.
Well, I think this is actually part and parcel with the whole increased density discussion. If you're going to increase housing density, you're also going to increase your public utility density, and these things are going to run into each other as we go forward. How you resolve those, I think, is probably what we're talking about here, or what's the best case we can apply to resolve those, realizing that you're not going to be able to keep a sum zero. That it's not, as you increase the density on both sides, something's going to have to give. And so we could talk about mitigation, but I really worry about what are the limits of it. And at some point, we have to accept the fact that you're not going to be able to mitigate your way out of these solutions.
And I think that's another reason why having other tools, mitigation tools like the banks or in lieu fee programs, is also going to be kind of important, more so in the long term, as you find that there's no way to compensate or mitigate on your site because you need every single square foot just to serve the students in the now larger community. So it's all connected.
I guess my comment is, all you have to do if you grew up in Seattle is look at how, even though the Growth Management Act intended to accommodate this burgeoning population, it didn't accommodate the problems, the unintended consequences of growth, and we're struggling, to deal with that. But, as best as you're able to write these steps down, it just shows that you've taken the time to have the conversation prior to what you can see coming down the pike, and then it hopefully helps to preserve public trust with public entities, agencies, school districts, utilities, everything. And it's the right thing to do.
Yeah. And I think the agencies learned a lot, I think, about how schools do planning and parks, is they didn't realize, for example, that the school district, before it proposes a new school or a school remodel, it's gone through a very extensive planning process at a high level, and has probably looked at like 16 properties trying to figure out where to put the thing and how to have the least amount of impacts and cost and balance all those things. And so that's one of the things that we were going to put in some way into the regulations, is that that first kind of mitigation sequencing layer, that folks have to document their early process of doing that large-scale planning and research and that sort of thing before you even came to the site that you're at. And hopefully that will provide comfort to the agencies and also demonstrate to the community that they have put a lot of thought in before they just decided we need this piece of property right here.
Because it can't really foresee the disruption in the way we do education now. That is coming. We're aware of it. We just don't know what the impact is going to be, but it will change everything.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because I think we can actually look at what the experience has been in other cities, particularly as close to us as Seattle.
Sure.
And we're going to face a lot of the same trade-offs that any city, Seattle being an example, has had to face. Do you want kids to go to school in your neighborhood, or do you want to consolidate them into a larger somewhere else?
Yeah.
Right.
That's a trade-off.
Right.
Yeah.
And those are decisions that you're not going to address as part of a mitigation strategy in a development request.
Right.
And that's, I guess, where I'm really backing this back up to a little higher level. That's where that level of community engagement and decision-making gets really hard. I mean, look at what's happened in Seattle over the years. I mean, you have like Ballard's just been up in arms because you've taken away my school.
Exactly.
But, then how do you deal with the fact that you've got less and less land to deal with that? And you're also changing your zoning requirements to increase the density, so you're actually creating the situation where there's going to be more kids and you're going to outgrow the facilities you've got. So I think there's the urban development quandary here that everybody faces at some point. Lots of people have already faced it. Kenmore's looking, I think, within the next 5 to 10 years at a repeat of that. So I don't think we have a way to solve this problem or address this problem through the mitigation strategies we're talking about here today. But I kind of look at this and say, okay, yeah, but where we're going to end up is this is not going to solve the problem that I think we may be able to satisfy the agencies, and we may be able to have a short-term reassurance to the community, but long-term, this is what we're doing, this is what we were doing to ourselves.
You can't foresee some of those things. And again, how people do education in the future may look very different. I mean, think about shopping. I mean, I just was at Northgate Mall, grew up in Seattle. It's the first shopping center in the whole nation. And it's going to be no more in 5 years. They will totally redevelop that piece of property. And people aren't going to shop there anymore like they do now. So I know education and our other community activities are different than shopping, but think about how shopping has been disrupted by something else wonderful that we all use, Amazon. You know, we can't really foresee everything that's going to happen in the brick and mortar world, that these regulations, but the land is scarce. We're not going to get any more of that, so we have to protect it, protect how we use it, and the steps that we take to develop it. And definitely Kenmore will see our day. All you have to do is drive to Kirkland. We're tiny. We often get overlooked in those, development bubble bursts of activity, but you can see that we need to prepare for that.
Very good discussion. I had maybe a little more prosaic question about the Puget Sound Energy they've done a lot of upgrades to their system in Kenmore in the last, I guess, at least couple of years, and maybe it's still ongoing. Have they pursued any exceptions to critical areas? And if so, is there any lessons from that the city could learn to maybe apply, and how this new process or this revised process will work?
They actually did do a project that replaced a major transmission corridor across the Swamp Creek wetland. And that was, I believe, processed as a PAUE because it met the standard of a utility, which we're holding on to.
Yeah.
And I don't know about lessons learned other than at the open house. One of the comments you'll read is that one of the attendees had commented that they were concerned that follow through, that if a PAUE was granted, that the city should be making sure that there was like a final inspection of the facility to be sure they had done it correctly. And I think that came up because when PSE did that, they actually used the wrong kind of poles. They had some horrible contaminant in there, and they had to go back in, pull out all the poles, and replace them. So anyway, but I don't think that was unique to PAUE. I think that's probably the case with any kind of a development, that follow through to make sure it's done correctly.
Which is something the city would normally do anyways, correct? Or is there a follow-up? I mean, is that a normal course of business for the city to follow up and make sure the acceptance is followed that way? Okay.
Right. And I'm not even sure whether the city discovered that or whether Puget PSE actually found that somehow they had made the mistake. I don't know the history of that.
Right. Well, there's a trade-off there too. I mean, obviously, we all appreciate having fewer outages, which I think has been the statistical trend in recent years. So, again, there's a public interest in that. Okay, thank you.
So do you want to move on to the Sammamish River focus group?
Yeah.
Okay, so the first one had a lot more philosophical type discussions in it. The Sammamish River docks and buffer ones is a lot more practical. So we got a lot of very good specific direction from particularly contractors, as well as agency input like from Fish and Wildlife and the Corps, to help us fine tune the proposed revisions to the dock regulations in particular. So we're going to be working with all of the feedback that they gave us on that front. I don't know that there's anything terribly interesting or surprising in there. When it comes to the buffers, I think in general the takeaway message was that yes, it definitely makes sense to look at the Sammamish River and look at the existing conditions and, do something better than 150 for everybody buffer. But I think there was some pressure, and it makes sense to me to do a little bit more splitting than what I did. I had kind of 2 zones, and I think they'd like us to take a much closer look at the existing conditions and see if we can nail that down a little finer so that that the proposed buffer numbers fit different reaches better. So we're going to be doing that, and we'll have that in the next third meeting? The third meeting, so we'll have some new numbers there. Otherwise, I think that was kind of the big discussion, really.
I might just jump in and say, with both forums, what we had said was that as we crafted the new standards, drafted them, we would provide them back to these folks who gave up all this time to give us their feedback, so we could, make sure we had captured their ideas. So you'll see, for example, when we get to the wetlands rules tonight, that the PAUE section is grayed out because we're going to be doing that and then sending it out to the agencies for their review before we bring it back to you.
Any other kind of questions or thoughts about Sammamish River specifically?
I had one sort of general one and one maybe a little more specific. So I know there was information here, and it makes a lot of sense about splitting up the standards for the river and Lake Washington. And are there any downsides to that? I think that was one of the questions that was raised about the potential downsides of having sort of those split standards versus the the more uniform one. I mean, the information makes it seem like it's a really good idea, especially the different water conditions. That all makes a lot of sense. But I'm just wondering if there's other.
I can't think of any downsides myself, and I don't know if implementation-wise, I think it's fairly straightforward. We're going to create a map that'll clearly show from this parcel gets this buffer and this parcel to that parcel, so there's not going to be any ambiguity. I think when you split things out a little bit, then maybe there's people who are on one side of that line, they're going to be like, I wish I had that buffer, but that's going to probably happen no matter what.
Yeah. I will say that that I think the reason that the agencies wanted the segments of the river to be smaller was because if the finer you split that, the more reflective of the buffer you can be. So, for example, they didn't want a big stretch suddenly reduced to 50 feet if there were 3 houses down at the end of that stretch that were set back at 100 feet. They're like, well, those people should have a 100-foot buffer so that we're not losing any more buffer than we already have. So that was, I think, the reason that they...
Yeah.
So the downside could be if you didn't do it finely enough, you could.
And you don't want to do it too fine either. We don't want a separate buffer for every single parcel either. So it's going to be just a matter of sort of looking for patterns and trends and figuring out some natural points to break it. We started with breaking it at the zoning because those were 2 very clear zones. So that's an easy step. And then after that, it gets a little trickier, and we'll be looking at things like lot depth and what's the potential and the existing condition, obviously. So we'll see where we land with that.
Right.
Do we have any sense of what we're considering, or are we looking at what, for instance, Bothel's done upstream in terms of, are we consistent, or consistent is the wrong word? Are we doing the same thing? How different are we?
We're going to be doing a similar process. So I worked on Bothel's SMP, and we did several different residential zones based on their specific local conditions. I don't think they had quite as broad a variability as you do in your residential waterfront development, but and similar to the Kirkland, I think I mentioned a few meetings back, I worked on that one as well, and I think we ended up with like 15 different residential zones because they had very strong patterns in different areas. Some areas that had just lots of huge, deep parcels, and some areas that the residences had to be like right up front because then there was a steep slope behind them. Plus they annexed that whole, what's that area called? Finn Hill area, and then that was just like a whole nother type of community, and so we did that for Kirkland. So this is not unusual to split things out, and I think it is an advantage in every way to the property owner in terms of particularly those that are not 150 feet back and are already 10 feet or 50 feet within that buffer. So
One more question about the meeting, sort of the composition. I know that was the intention to have the agencies be largely involved, and I guess there's one consultant here. It sounds like you did shoreline design. I guess I'm wondering what's the process, and I'm sure that comes at some point for involving the landowners. In terms of
we considered
this and
that.
crafting, and so I'm wondering and hoping, and I'm sure there will be opportunities for them to, weigh in individually or collectively or however they.
I think
they
we invited to, before I talk about the landowners, we invited 3 different contractors as well, and only one accepted.
Oh, this.
So that's why
this gentleman, this consultant.
Greg
here?
Ashley. Yeah.
Right, the consultants do a lot of the work for the private property owners. They hire somebody to do their docks or whatever, and so,
Representative.
right, of the interests
Advocate.
of the private
Right,
landowners.
right.
And so we had, as Amy said, we invited 3 different groups, but only the one
Right.
attended. And that particular gentleman has been at several of your meetings.
Yeah, I think he's the only one who was here for the first 6 or something like that. And he provided very good feedback, and there was even a question where we got a different message from the meeting, and I shot him can you clarify what you meant? And he shot me back a diagram, and this is what he got approved, and it's like, oh, okay. And so we'll be able to take that and move forward with a fair amount of confidence that that's something that not only he would like and presumably property owners would like, but it's actually permittable, which in the end is a good thing to have in your code. Yeah.
Is there a plan at some point I know you do this for other public hearings to notify, I guess, all the potential people who own land that would potentially be affected on the river and
Yeah,
the lake? At what stage does that happen?
Yeah. So we had not planned to do that. The critical area project is broad, and as you can imagine, there are hundreds and hundreds of property owners, and we can't even tell exactly where they are. Sammamish River is easier, but with the wetlands and streams. So that's why we advertised the open house the way we did. We had an ad in the newspaper. There was actually a story. We sent it out over all of our social media. We posted flyers. So we felt like we had done a good job advertising that to the community rather than a direct mail effort. So that was our perspective on it.
From the folks I talked to at the open house, it seemed like we did get a good smattering of folks that were actually waterfront property owners, so it seems to have been effective.
I thought it was very well attended,
I did too.
and I was actually shocked. I'm working on a civic engagement project on the east side, and to get citizens and people that your policy or recommendations affect to actually engage prior to making these decisions, it's kind of amazing that you got people to come. So it tells you something about the atmosphere and the culture of Kenmore is, you've done a good job of demonstrating, I think, to the public that you want civic engagement, but then you also have people that are willing to take their time and come. So
The other comment I might make about engagement is that, for example, we had a flyer about the open house up on our permit counter, and now every person who comes to the permit counter who's thinking of applying for a permit is advised that we're doing this, if they have a critical area, they're advised that we're doing this update, encouraged. I've had a number of people call me and say, I'm in this stage of the process, what's your timing? And then what we do with those folks is we add them to our list, so then they get everything that you guys get. So we're trying to keep more and more people engaged.
Right. And I presume you'll do that on citywide communications, your newsletter. And
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Well, it sounds like you're doing good stuff and reaching out. That was really my thought here. So.
So I guess we were going to just talk a little bit about the open house, which we've kind of just done. So like you already said, I thought it was amazingly well attended. I've been to a lot of these critical areas regs and SMP things, and you were lucky to get like 3 people roll in. So that was amazing. And people were really engaged, had really good constructive comments and thoughtful questions, and I think we were busy at every single board the whole time, and the hour and a half flew by. So we're going to be incorporating input we got and questions we got as well into our regulations revision proposals. So unless there's other questions, I think that kind of sums up our public outreach efforts this past month. Okay. And then what's next on our agenda?
So if we're finished with that topic, we'll move right into the first set of regulations. So as I mentioned, the 2 segments we're looking at tonight are really the purpose and sort of the general regulations, and then the specifics for wetlands. So what we tried to do was to take the gap analysis and plug in the recommended changes, and then also, having heard your feedback on the gap analysis, if you had requested changes or you had certain things that you were looking for, plug those in as well. So rather than go through page by page, I know it's a lot of material.
Yeah.
Hopefully you have questions, and we can try to answer those and make adjustments as need be.
Laura, I'm sorry, can you tell me which page that
You know, my version does not have all the numbers.
That's, let's see.
If it is, it's on the laptop if you want to pull it up. And it's probably the second, here, I'll confirm it.
Okay. Oh, yeah. So here are the page numbers. Is the whole packet numbered? But it's not numbered with that. Right. So I think that was attachment.
Attachment B,
Critical.
E, and it says attachment 5.
Okay. Got it.
Okay.
There's a lot of attachments.
There were a lot of attachments.
I read it, I just want to make sure I was on the right
Sure.
page.
So again, I wasn't intending to go page by page. I think that'll take a super long time, but we can do it that way if you'd prefer. And otherwise, we'll just do it by exception, so you can raise, as we've done with all these other things, raise issues or questions.
Anybody have any thoughts, comments, questions on this section?
We also got some really good comments from other staff members that have kind of also been incorporated into here as well. From Development Services and Parks.
Public Works.
Oh, Public Works, yeah.
Yeah, I guess I had a couple things here on page, looks like page 5 here under 18.55.090 at the subsection D, and it talks about areas adjacent to critical areas subject to regulation. It talks about bald eagle nests, and again, it's goes from a half mile to I can't even read it here. A much 660 feet. That's a 75%. If my math is right on that. Is there a what's behind that?
Yeah, the origin of that number was from I think the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. So.
Oh. Okay.
Yeah, so the delisting at the state and federal level, that half mile distance was lost.
Oh.
And now we have the 660.
Under federal.
Right, and now we just have
authority,
this
okay.
one law remaining that kind of governs the bald eagle, or there's a couple others, but this is the primary one. And 660 feet's the number that's included in
So-
those.
So we basically, we're updating our comprehensive codes to reflect what currently is on the books federally.
Right, to provide
To
a link
keep
to
it.
that process.
Yeah.
And, yeah,
And then that would also apply to the Heron Rookery buffer too.
yes, we had some new science and new recommendations from the state that changed the number on that particular species, and
Okay.
so that's why we changed that one. I think
Okay.
it was a 2012 study.
And just one other thing, when that was on the fencing, on page, what is that, page 9 and of this, it talks about required permanent fence can be one of, it looks like two different types. And who makes that choice in terms of what kind of fencing? Is it up to the landowner, or?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think they would make the proposal in their application materials for whichever fence.
Okay, and the city has to approve it? Or
Right.
you just have to know it's one or the other. It's
Right.
their choice. And is there any sort of environmental difference between those two choices? Is there any?
There's probably pros and cons to either one. The vegetation, I think the environmental concern is, will it be maintained and will it thrive and grow, and what happens if you don't water it and then you end up with
Yeah.
no fence. Wood and split rail are generally not good barriers for basketballs and children and baseballs and those types of things, whereas a thorny rose fence might be a little bit more of a barrier. So I think they're each good for in different settings probably. And then it'll be up to, so I think C, maintenance is added to ensure, one of the things to ensure long-term maintenance. So I think that there'll be a little bit of a hook to make sure that the vegetation buffer in particular doesn't fail.
Okay. Okay, thanks. Anybody else have any?
Did we go over these earlier?
Yeah, a lot of these are in the gap analysis as kind of our recommendation, and then some of those you provided, you're like, yes, sounds good, and others you're like, well, let's talk about this more and propose tweaks. And so that language is now stuck into here, as well as additional feedback we received from other city staff or other public input. But a lot of this you've seen verbatim before.
Any more thoughts?
Okay.
So what do you need? You need anything else from
So
us,
I don't
Lori,
need
or-
anything from you at this point. So what we'll be doing, as I said, is bringing this material forward in batches. So you'll see 2 more batches at your November meetings. And then we're hopeful that you may even be ready to hold a public hearing your first meeting in December. If you are not ready for that, then we would have to delay it until next year, but I wouldn't be surprised if we could get there. Probably the biggest chunk is the shoreline rules, and that's one of the ones that you'll see at your second meeting in November. Okay.
What's this one with the gray?
That's the public agency and utility exception, and that was the one that I said was grayed out because we were going to send the draft back to the folks who participated in the forum before we brought it forward.
I got you.
Yeah. That's what this was, it's attached to this conversation that they had. Now, there's a couple pages where there are no maps provided, but I think in our earlier discussions, we got to look at them.
Yeah, I think the ones that are attached to the comp plan packet are generally the maps.
Kind of the big picture maps.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
We have another, right,
That-
yeah.
Okay, any further business? That looks like our agenda is completed. Anything else for the needs to come up today? Okay, I adjourn this meeting.
Thank you.